My name's Melissa Ronaldson. I'm a practicing herbalist and I want to talk about specifically the use of some of the plants that we're growing here. But I want to talk about them in a very particular context. I hope to suggest that the point of looking at medicinal plants, the point at going back to herbal medicine, isn't from some kind of sentimental, quaint interest in past things. I hope that we're going to consider that actually using herbal medicine and using home remedies is something that's really relevant to our contemporary healthcare. So the context, the particular context that you would have all heard of at the moment, is the issue of the crisis of antibiotic resistance. It's been on the news. To give it a little bit of history, I think probably you're familiar with the details, but we know that in 1928, Alexander Fleming went on holiday. Some mould flew into his petri dish. He came back, the mould had started to inhibit the growth of bacteria, and he thought, oh my goodness, there's something in this. And later, a few years later, antimicrobial medicine, antibacterial medicine called penicillin was developed. At that point, Alexander Fleming had noticed that after a while it stopped working. But in the flush of optimism and in the flush of sense of opportunity that happened at that time, completely understandably, we lost sight of that a little bit. People also lost sight, and let's be really clear, suddenly things that had been life-threatening, things that had been killing people, the smallest of infections, suddenly became mundane occurrences. You could cure them by going to your doctor and getting antibiotics. So it was really understandable that people were really optimistic, that they thought that this was the way forward, that maybe we would live forever, that modern medicine had all the answers. So through that time, what happened is that doctors would give antibiotics just in case. People would go to the doctor, they'd go with a virus, and we know that antibiotics work specifically against bacteria, not against viruses. But you'd go with a cold, and the doctor would give you some antibiotics just in case it turned into a chest infection, or just because you wanted them. And meanwhile, the farmers were going, goodness, we've got to feed all these people. We need more intensive methods of farming. So we're going to farm in such a way that the animals are, I'm trying to think of a different word to locked up, intensive farming methods, which raised issues around health of the livestock. So somebody said, I know what we'll do is just in case, prophylactically, we'll put the antibiotics into the feed. So, accumulatively, these things happened. We know that the consequence was that bacteria developed resistance against the drugs that were being used against them. We know that if you have a secret weapon, the most important thing that you need to do is, keep it secret. So if you constantly are exposing the nature of that weapon, then the bacteria or whoever have the opportunity to develop counter strategies to that. So this has happened. We come to today. That was a very brief history, but the context of that is important. And I'm just going to read something that the director of the World Health Organization wrote in 2012. It's kind of chilling, but it's really important, and it sets the context. Margaret Chan said in 2012, a post-antibiotic era means, in effect, an end to modern medicine as we know it. Things as common as strep throat or a child's scratched knee could once again kill. Some sophisticated interventions like hip replacements, organ transplants, cancer chemotherapy and care of preterm infants would become far more difficult or too dangerous to undertake. At a time of multiple calamities in the world, we cannot allow the loss of essential antimicrobials, essential cures for many millions of people, to become the next global crisis. She said that in 2012. There's a report that came out last week coordinating the different possible strategies. It's really chilling, and I don't mean to bring such a heavy thing to this conversation, and yet that is the context. That is the context of us considering ways of responding to that. Some of the solutions may come from new, different, improved antibiotics. You know, there is a role for the pharmaceutical companies to continue doing what they've done in the past, which is develop more complicated or more complex or different, coming from a different angle, antimicrobials. There is a problem in that, for good or evil, the pharmaceutical industry or the research for medicines is profit-led. So there's not a lot of drive to invest in a product that might be obsolete in 6 months. So there's an issue there, but that may be something that can be addressed. Other areas of science are bringing other really positive possibilities. We're not in a terrible situation yet. The other thing that we have to do really urgently is stop using the antibiotics except when we really need them. You know, I have no ideological attachment. From my point of view, antibiotics are brilliant. You know, I've got a son, and if he's really ill, I want them to be some antibiotics available that work if he gets meningitis or if he gets, you know, we need them. We need them to be there. We need to not use them unless we really have to. Which brings me round to, why would we not be looking at the knowledge and the evidence of people's 4,000 years of recorded interaction with infection using plants? Surely that's madness to do that. Not to do that. I hope that that's what we're going to begin to do, but there are some problems in our recent ways of looking at medicine that make it difficult for us to return to using plants and home remedies in particular. I suppose I need to say, I want to talk about home remedies. I think there's a big role for herbal medicine from a skilled position. There's a big role for practitioners in quite serious infections. There's a lot of new evidence about interactions with herbs and antibiotics, but let's put that aside now as practitioner skilled help, and let's talk about home remedies. The problem is that we've got out of the habit of seeing things in a certain way. And what we need to do is understand that if we use a herbal medicine approach, it's really different to a pharmaceutical approach. And this is the thing that I'm saying about learning to be bilingual. I don't want to swap one paradigm for another. I'm not saying that we need to be holistic instead of scientific. That's a juxtaposition. I'm saying that we need to hold paradigms simultaneously and be bilingual among them. I can give 5 examples where the use of herbal medicine compared to pharmaceutical medicine is different. Monique talked earlier about single compounds and multi-compounds. This is the first one. This is really important. All these plants here, they don't contain 10 chemicals. They contain hundreds of chemicals. And not only that, they're shifting and changing according to where they grew, according to the light, according to the weather, according to the mineral content of the soil, according to the stresses that they've been under, according to the microbes that have been attacking them. So this is a really complex cocktail. And in the past, that would have been argued that that's a disadvantage because we were always hoping to look for the active ingredient We wanted the single bullet. What's the important active chemical? Can we find the, the really powerful thing, and then we can extract it? And what we're beginning to feel sometimes is that actually the shifting dynamic complexity of all those interactions can sometimes be equally powerful. Sometimes it's even more appropriate. And we do know that microbes seem to find it harder to develop resistance to that complex shifting target. So that's one thing that we have to be different on. The other thing is that prophylactic, that word just in case, has been a disaster. Using antibiotics prophylactically has been the cause of the problem. We shouldn't have been exposing the bacteria to our secret weapon. On the other hand, with herbs, we want to use things prophylactically. We want to make people healthy. We want to take things just in case. So that's another thing that we have to hold differently. I'll come back to that in more detail in a minute. Ecologies, that's a different thing as well. With antibiotics, it was really important to go in and to finish the course and wipe out the whole colony. You couldn't allow any of the bacteria to be left standing to walk off and limp away, because they were probably going to regroup and come back and fight another day. With a herbal medicine approach, this isn't so important, because the development of the resistance isn't the core thing. So if you go in like weed in a forest garden, you don't need to wipe out everything. You can allow things to grow in an ecology. It doesn't matter if you have some of the bacteria, because the ecology is so strong that they will be outcompeted by the other things that are living there. So sometimes it's like when you go weeding in your garden. It's not, you don't leave your garden to its own devices, but sometimes you go and pull out the bindweed, or you pull out the things that are getting in the way of other things thriving. So that's the third one. The fourth one is about evidence base. And I was so glad that Monique started to talk about this, and what she was saying was so important. And I think our understanding of what is evidence is really shifting, and her stories really illustrated that we need to, if we stick within our scientific paradigm of what we think is important, we're going to miss a lot of tricks. The thing with pharmaceutical medicine, I think it's really important and utterly relevant. If you're developing something that is new and powerful, that human beings haven't evolved to have any experience of, you need to test it. You need to test it to the nth degree. You need to make sure that you publish all the studies, not just the positive ones. And I think everyone has every right to go, we want that with placebo child-controlled clinical trials. We want every level of testing. With herbal medicine, I'm not sure that we require that same level of evidence base. There will be times when we do, but there will be other times when it just will not be available, because partly the model that we're existing by to some extent at the moment means that if you're going to invest the money to research, you want a product at the end of it, not an outcome. And actually we're talking about outcomes sometimes. So who's going to invest in that? Who's got the funding for us all to have, take elderberries and have less flu? Why would anybody invest into that? Well, who would have the money to invest in that? Maybe the evidence for that is something that we have to gather differently to the pharmaceutical model. Fifth one, and this is when I'm going to talk about these herbs again. The strange thing about using herbal medicine is that we will use some things to be antimicrobial that have no antimicrobial activity if you tested them in a test tube. So I'm saying that the 5 differences, the paradigm things that we have to hold are the multi-compound. Prophylactic works in herbal medicine, it doesn't work in pharmaceutical antibiotics. We need an ecological approach. We need to consider what we require from an evidence base. And we need to take on this thing that maybe antimicrobial doesn't always mean directly antimicrobial. I've made up 4 categories to divide herbs into. The first category is a very broad category of herbs that support the individual. Now those herbs might not have any specific antimicrobial activity, but they might stop people getting infections. Examples might be herbs that help you sleep. Examples might be herbs that work on your adrenals, that help you lower your cortisol levels and not be so stressed. Another example might be hawthorn. I mean, it's as far as I know, it doesn't have any antimicrobial activity. As I said that, I thought, I don't know, maybe it does. But it's specifically what we know about it is it's a cardiotonic. It helps slow and strengthen the heart rate by increasing the oxygen supply to the heart. It also, the berries help the integrity of the veins. So in a person of a certain age, as we get older, that is a useful tonic that will help you maintain your health. If you took the hawthorn and the dandelion together, that would be a fantastic home remedy combination. And again, I wouldn't be saying take this to lower your blood pressure once you've started medication. But if you were considering that your blood pressure was a bit high, your doctor had told you to take some lifestyle changes, you might change your diet, you might take up more exercise, and you might drink dandelion and hawthorn. That would be the practical way to use that. Right, second category, herbs to support our mechanical or passive immune systems. By that I mean my skin is part of my immune system. It's the first barrier that keeps out microbes. And because I'm a little bit like a donut, I've got a hole in the middle that goes all the way down, and the tissue on the inside is quite similar to the tissue on the outside, actually. Herbs that help my immune system are very similar. Often herbs that help my skin will be herbs that help the mucous membrane all the way through. So I'm looking at plantain. If you imagine my skin, if you imagine that it was red, if you imagine I'd scratched it and it was inflamed and sore, or it was kind of gone a little bit baggy from being constantly red and inflamed, you'd know that that would be the part of me that would be susceptible to infection. You'd know that if it was on the outside. I mean, that's the same all the way through this donut self that you have, or, in your mucous membranes, in your throat, right down, to cystitis, right down to the urinary tract. If the tissue is sore, if the tissue is not completely toned and stretchy and at its best, it's more likely to house infections. So again, we give herbs that are soothing, that are toning. Marshmallow or mallow would be another herb that comes into that category. Cleavers. Where's the cleavers? I had some on me. This sticky willy, I think, was the herb of today. Traditionally, lumps and bumps, your immune system is like a motorway that runs simultaneously to your circulation, but it hasn't got the pump of the heart. So when you get bottlenecks, like your glands come up, and that's a reflection of too much activity. You need to flush it out, it drains into your gut, and then you get rid of the debris. Cleavers seems to really, or traditionally is thought to really stimulate that process. It definitely makes you pee, right? This is a brilliant herb to take in the spring. I would always say it's a fantastic spring cleaning herb, just to maybe help flush your immune system through so that when it has to deal with something, it hasn't got any bottlenecks to go through. So fantastic home remedy, not directly antimicrobial, but as soon as you feel a bit of busyness, something coming on, drink loads of cleavers. So herbs to support, the individual herbs to support mechanical or passive immune systems. My third category is herbs to support the chemical mediated or active immune system. This is a little bit more complicated, but if you think of herbs, I was struggling and then I could see it over there. If you think of herbs like echinacea, so there seems to be evidence that it seems to have some modulating effect. It seems to have some impact anyway on our white blood cells. It perhaps stimulates them to respond to infection. Certainly, we know that elderflower has some relationship with our cytokine response, with our immune system response to infection. So by taking the elderflower, that's such a good example. I'm going to stick with that elderflower over there. So that will actually stimulate your immune system. What it's also doing is it helps with that prophylactic thing. If you take, I think it's elderberries, but it might be the flowers as well. By drinking it, you leave compounds to line, for example, your throat, and that makes it difficult for viruses to latch on. So it's like a mechanical guard as well. So it's chemical mediated, it's mechanical mediated. Obviously, the berries are full of vitamin C. That's why it's called the poor man's pharmacy, by the way. Elderflower has so many different things that it can do. Fourth category is antimicrobial. And that category is when you put things in a test tube and it kills them. We've also got those. We've got garlic, we've got ginger. And the point is, lots of those herbs don't just do that one thing. They do lots of the different things. I meant to relate everything to the herbs here. I've got a little bit lost. But let's just go through them a bit. So, yarrow. I mean, I would use that. I would use it for heavy periods, actually. Greek soldiers used to never go to battle without it. It seems to be good at stopping bleeding, but it also has antiseptic possibilities. You can see that if you wanted to pack a wound, it would be quite good to mesh around. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that that's a home remedy. I would say if you have that kind of wound in Bethnal Green, you call an ambulance, obviously, but you can imagine it. Is this a marshmallow or is it a common mallow? Where's Gabby? I think that's a common, yeah. Could have been a baby marshmallow. I mean, this with the plantain, these are the mucous membrane tonics. They will tone and soothe the inside and the outside of the part of you that is that donut, and that's really important. Inula. I mean, this isn't really, it doesn't grow indigenously, although it's indigenous. But when I think of this as a garden plant, it's elecampane, elfwort. Traditionally, it was really useful if you ever got shot by an elf. What happens if you get shot by an elf? You get a hole, an invisible hole, and all your energy drains out, which maybe isn't so different from ME or some of the things that people feel. It's really useful for that. There was a study in Dublin about 4 or 5 years ago in a test tube that seemed to demonstrate that extract of this root was 100% effective against MRSA in a test tube. So again, this is probably a very useful antimicrobial. Nettles, we've got nettles stopping bleeding, hay fever. Again, you know that if you're really inflamed and up and congested with hay fever, you're more likely to be prone to infection. These little hairs inject a histamine-like substance into you that maybe, when they're fresh, maybe brings on your own antihistamine response. Full of iron and vitamin C, and vitamin C helps you absorb iron. I mean, that's the beautiful example of the combination of plants. This is mugwort. I'm going to end on this little story. I wasn't going to tell it because my Greek history is really dodgy. So if what the story I tell is wrong, I apologise. Maybe you'll just take the parable of it or the metaphor. Because it came up, we've been talking about Artemisia as a theme. This is Artemisia vulgaris, this is mugwort. This is related to the Artemisia annua that we mentioned earlier, that looks to be very useful in relation to malaria. Well, no, we know that in the 60s, artemisinin was extracted from Artemisia annua, that was our most powerful anti-malarial to date. We know that there's a worry that we're developing resistance to artemisinin. Paula did her dissertation, sorry to show you up, but she did a fantastic dissertation on a project in Africa where people had started because, and as we know, the artemisinin is very powerful. There are still lots of people dying of malaria, partly because they can't afford to buy the medicine. So if you haven't got the medicine, it doesn't really do anything. Paula looked at a project where an NGO was giving people Artemisia annua seeds to grow in their garden. And some very early studies seemed to show that drinking the tea was effective as the artemisinin. Now, some people have been really worried about that because they're saying it's unethical to give subclinical levels of artemisinin. How can it be working? But possibly it's working because there's 50 other chemicals in there that are doing other different things. And that brings me back to the story of Artemis. So I think this is true. If not, I've made it up and it'll do anyway. But Artemis was in competition with her twin brother, Apollo. And he was trying to wind her up. And he was trying to compete with her. And he said, I bet you can't shoot your bow and arrow as well as me. And she said, oh, yes, I can. And he said, all right then, over there, in the far, far distance, there's a far target, a little round globe. Can you hit it? And she went, yes, of course I can. So she got out her arrow and she took an aim and she flew her arrow over and she hit the target. Tragically, he was the only lover that she'd ever been in love with, and she killed him, which is a terrible story, and I think a parable of feminism and competing. But for me, it's also a parable about herbal medicine and biomedicine, and not, if we try to compete in the same arena endlessly, we're going to lose a really important part of ourselves, and it would be madness to do that. Right, thank you. That's